Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for being here and indeed keeping the energy levels high. I'm very glad today to be joined by Paola, who will be able to share some of her insights from her work. Paola works at the International Institute of Sustainable Development, and she has a lot of experience discussing all kinds of problems related to sustainable transitions across the world. And so I think this is going to offer very interesting insights for all of us to maybe zoom out the debate a little bit compared to what we may have heard so far. So thank you so much for being with us today. And I'd like to launch the conversation picking up where the introduction left it off, which is that we tend to think of sufficiency more, let's say, from a global north perspective, although that term is not very precisely defined. And from my own experience working on questions of energy access in countries such as India, the term of sufficiency or the idea associated with it does not always resonate in the same way that it does here, right? With some places, some people pushing strongly back against this very notion. And so that said, you have done a lot of work on this topic around a wide range of different contexts, and I believe you have a more nuanced view than me on precisely this question. And so I'd like to hear first, to get us started, what has been your experience when thinking about this idea of sufficiency, of limitations in context around the world through your own research and your own work?
Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here with this excellent room full of people. So just two words about me so you get a little bit where I come from. So I'm originally born and raised in Bogota, Colombia, which, depending on how you define it, could be considered a global south country. But I moved after my studies to Germany, which is considered a global north country, and lived there for a number of years. So I guess through my personal experience, I'm going to bring some of those examples precisely from those countries so that we can compare. And on sufficiency, now, as you say, I think there's not a common understanding how everyone is talking about this. And I don't want to underplay by any means the notion, which is actually a fact, that there is overconsumption of a lot of unnecessary things, especially in wealthy countries, which is absolutely true. But I want to avoid going into that direction in this talk because I'm a macroeconomist. So I'm an economist, and I like to think about big picture, about big trends, and I think a lot of the sufficiency discussions, they turn around the issue to make it about individual choices for the individual, but we don't realize how the system is also making some of those choices be extremely more complex for certain people than others. So as a comparison, you could say Switzerland and the US are both global north countries, but the energy consumption is 5 times higher for an American person than a Swiss person. And it is about individual choices, yes, of course, but what are your individual choices for your personal transport if there is no public transport, nor trains, nor anything that you can use? So I want to take that approach, and yeah, maybe we dive into these things. So I want to make a divide on personal choices and system issues, and I also would like to bring some nuance on global north and global south countries. We can go into that because I think there are blurred lines, and even within the same countries, if you just look at averages, you're completely missing the full picture of how some people have more choices than others, how the income is distributed, and how the choices are distributed within countries. So I wouldn't say a poor person in Germany living in the Lausitz, which is the coal mining area, lives any better or has used more their rights to develop than a rich person in Colombia, in the high class of some of the cities. So I would also like to make that distinction, maybe some clarifying points to start with. But yeah, maybe we can dive into it. Thank
Yeah,
you.
so let's maybe then follow up on this, right? So your point is that it's really hard to compare across countries, given that a lot of the difference comes from more systemic level questions, right? So maybe then to follow up on this, my understanding is that you have worked or are familiar with communities that have engaged into forms of sufficiency in outside the industrialist countries. And so can you tell us a bit about some of these examples? I believe you mentioned in Colombia as well. If you could tell us about some of these initiatives, to what extent are they scaling up? Is there appetite for scaling up these kinds of initiatives, and so forth?
Yes, thank you. So maybe to clarify first, so I think a lot of the talks and discussions around sufficiency, they quickly go into the degrowth area, which is if we keep growing, we cannot uh, sustain this. So some countries and some people, like they have to degrowth so that others can grow. And I think that is for some aspects an useful discussion we might have, because yeah, the idea of eternal growth as an economist, I also think is quite limited in the way we understand societies, or economic growth as being the main sort of goal of society and humankind. So I think it's useful for certain things, but I think is dividing because it quickly brings you to, but look at all the poor people in the developing countries. They need more energy, they need to grow, the economies need to grow, and they need to distribute, and there's this whole, I guess, uh, yeah, rights to develop discussions, which for equity and for many reasons, sometimes it's not helpful. And it brings you to a deadlock where, okay, if developed countries did it already, then the right to develop of the other countries is to go the same way, but then we're all cooked with climate change. So it brings you to that sort of space, and I would like to not go there by bringing some examples um, of how alternative narratives and alternative possibilities, they are existing in the global south. So it's not that every person, I cannot speak for every person in the global south, obviously not. I'm just giving examples. It's not that every person in the global south will be against degrowth or will be against sufficiency and would say this is only something that has to happen in the global north. Actually, my experience working, so my PhD I wrote on coal phase out, and I went around to visit a lot of communities living in the surroundings of coal mining areas, which if you don't know about it, they don't have water, their land is completely dry, so they barely have any food, and they experience a lot of the inequality impacts of these big extraction sites. They're not expecting for the people in Switzerland, the US, to stop consuming growth. They are proposing solutions that they can implement in their reality and then in their constraints. And those solutions are not, yeah, building big houses and having AC for everyone and driving big cars. It's actually going back to the roots, having more resilient agroecology systems, having a land ownership that is shared, having family structures that support each other, among many other definitions of what we understand as development, as life quality, and it's coming from them. So just to give you two examples of discourses that have been named or theorized or analyzed by academics in the global south, we have the Ubuntu discourse that's coming from African countries, and in Latin America we have a very similar version of that understanding, which is the Buen Vivir philosophy, and it's basically a number of discourses from people in the global south which say, no, increasing our energy consumption, having cars, having a job, moving to the city, and having a big car, that's not our understanding of development, and they have alternatives to that, which might not generate GDP or growth in that sense. So you could consider them degrowth alternatives, but the point is not about degrowth. It's about increasing the life quality and the understanding of development. And I think that is very, very valuable. And I think those discourses, they should be a lot more present in the global north to understand what can we learn from that. Because actually a lot of the things they're saying, they're also applied to the global north to increase the quality of life of people here. And it's not only about stop driving a car or building smaller houses. It's a much wider understanding of development, sufficiency, and the role of quality life and what that means.
Thank you. Maybe let me follow up on what you talked. You mentioned phase out of coal mines, which is a topic that I've also been very interested in. And I think this brings to the fore one potential challenge in these questions, right? Which is that, assuming a world in which, again, industrialized countries reduce consumption, right? This may in all likelihood have external effects as well on countries that currently rely as a source of income from exports towards the richer countries. Can you tell us a bit more about what are some of the vulnerabilities out there in the global macroeconomic landscape from such a transition, and what are also maybe some of the opportunities for well-positioned countries, well-positioned economies in the future from such a move if it were to happen?
Yes, thank you. So I'll give you the example with coal, but that can work with pretty much anything that you think about. And I guess what I'm going to say is the main reason why some people, they're not advocating anymore for just fossil fuel phase out, but for a more systemic change. And that is countries, again, like Colombia, I'm going to bring this example, that are very reliant on exports of commodities, in this case coal, which accounts for 15 to 20% of the exports. So it's like a significant share of the exports. They have to face this industry down, but let's say whatever country, Malaysia, that depends on manufacturing clothes, if we stop buying clothes, whatever, like it's an industry, it has significant macroeconomic importance, especially for the export-oriented sector, is declining for whatever reason. You run out of resources, or you want to do climate policy, or simply demand collapses in the world. Regardless of the reason, you could see the same vulnerability or dynamic playing a role, which is everyone is talking in the global north about energy transition as replacing energy from, let's say, a coal power plant with solar panels. So it's it's a replacement of energy, which is mostly a technical question, maybe economic as well, although the economics are better now, and maybe logistic, but it's mostly a technical question. However, when you have an export-oriented economy that's dependent on a commodity, on this, you're not talking about replacing energy by energy. You're talking about replacing entire industries that have to be competitive in a global market, where if you're talking about industries, you have to compete with China at an industrial level. If you're talking about commodities, you have to hope that what you have in your endowments is something that is demanded in the global market. It's a very precarious and very try and error thing. You want to diversify your export basket. If something is phasing out, because it requires industrial policy, it requires putting yourself out in the global market, it requires a lot of much more complicated things than installing solar panels or installing windmills, right? So the countries phasing out coal or oil or whatever, they have this question, but it could be applied to any commodity that is export-oriented. And why do they need to export? Why don't they just stop exporting and become, I don't know, self-sufficient or whatever? Because they have not industrialized. So a lot of the countries in the old model of economic growth, you will go first to an agricultural society, then at some point you will industrialize, and then when you're really developed, you move to the service economy. But that has not happened in the last 30 or 40 years, where a lot of countries, they have jumped the industrialization phase, because China is providing most of the industrial goods and the global north countries. So they've jumped completely from basically agriculture-based societies to service-oriented societies. So they have they don't have first the experience to build an industrial base, nor the competitive advantage, the skills, nothing, nor the money to invest on this. So basically, to survive and to have anything from cars to computers to anything you call modernity, even the power plants, they have to import those goods. And to import those goods, you need forex. You need currency that is not your currency. You need mostly US dollars in most of these countries. The only way you get a hand on US dollars is exporting something. So they're basically in a situation where if they don't replace this export sector with something similar, equivalent, that will give them enough foreign currency, they will face depreciation, which means their foreign debt, their external debt goes up, their trade accounts balance gets completely out of control, and this creates a lot of macroeconomic problems which can spiral down, basically. So this is the main vulnerability. I don't think we're by any means there if people stop consuming a little bit in the global north, but as a basic principle, if you think about a fossil fuel phase out or any commodity, this is a thing that countries are facing, and I think that is mainly the reason why we're seeing very vocal countries like from the global south talking about debt restructuring, so debt swaps for climate and all these alternative solutions for getting climate finance, basically. It's because there's more systemic issues around how would they do this transition, how would they finance this transition, and how would they keep their economy more or less working at the same time without going into this downward spiral. Lots of complex topics, but I hope the mechanism of what this vulnerability is there and it's already being faced by a lot of countries is clear.
Yeah, so that's very interesting because it speaks to some of the experiences I made talking with policymakers. For instance, I was talking with policymakers in the state of Jharkhand in India, which is a big coal-producing state, and exactly what you said came up, right? It's how do you replace entire industries, right? Because it's not just about changing a technology; it's about providing jobs for hundreds of thousands of people and people who depend on that. So maybe to wrap up, because I think we're probably running out of time. To wrap up on this is, you mentioned diversification of the economy in some sense as one of the ways forward to address some of these bottlenecks. Maybe if you could just kind of tell us a bit more about some of these, say, non-technological obstacles that may slow down these kind of sustainable transitions. We talked a bit about coal again. When you have these concentrated industries, what do they look like? And if diversification is one of the solutions, what is going to be what are the interventions are needed to achieve that?
We could talk about hours about non-technological barriers
Me
to
too.
the transitions, probably. But maybe to go back a little bit to what I said at the beginning, that I don't like to make this very hard line distinction between global south and global north for many reasons. One of them being the elites in global south countries. So if you look at most countries, okay, some of them have overcome this, but most of them, if they have huge resource endowments of very demanded commodities or very scarce commodities in the global markets, you will most likely see most of the rent from those commodities being appropriated by an elite, but a very small group of people very well connected to the either local politicians or even if it's big enough, national politicians, putting even dictatorships in place. So let's say the political economy around these resource endowments is very, very biased towards a few elite members, and that's also the same reason why, despite having enormous resource rents, this has not trickled down to development at the bottom of society, and you still have largely impoverished and underdeveloped societies in countries that are otherwise very rich in terms of resources. So I guess giving the incentives to that elite to move away from their business, and not only do that, but have a new business that is more socially distributed, let's say solar panels for everyone, so that they don't have to pay for electricity and can grow their own food. It's, as you all can imagine, very challenging, and they're disproportionately powerful in decision making in many of these countries. That's just one example. Then we could talk about what I just say, the skill sets. You don't do industrialization policy like, hello, let's just create this great industry that can outcompete China and make chips or whatever. You don't have this. So there's a lot of institutional capacity even for taxation. Like, economists love carbon pricing. Let's put carbon pricing everywhere. That will solve the problem. But the thing is, in a lot of countries, you don't even have the state capacity to collect, to monitor, to collect, and to basically implement your carbon tax. So, as I say, very long list. You could talk about institutional, political, and many other barriers. And I'm happy, I'll stay around if somebody wants to talk about some of these topics, but I hope that gives you an idea of where I'm hinting at.
Thank you so much for answering my questions. I think this is an opportunity for also hear from the audience. I believe we were collecting questions. I don't know if they...
Of a few here ready. So this is a question that we received previously, and maybe in a couple of sentences you can answer it, wrapping up your whole discussion. So overregulation tend to impact the poor more than the rich. How could this negative effect be omitted?
I'm not sure in which context we're talking. Maybe like I lived in Germany 10 years. I know what you mean with overregulation. But let's try to bring the global
or badly or poor regulation, right? Speaking to what you just finished on, right, is the regulations that doesn't necessarily solve market failures or anything like this, but tends to be used as rent seeking.
Yeah, so you have all sorts, like overregulation, I would say could be a name toward it, but to call it, but you have in many places, even within countries that you're like, that's a very stable country. Take a look at Chile, or like, that's a very democratic, very OECD, good governance country. Even in those type of countries, you even have areas where there's no rule of law, basically. Like I come from Colombia, you have neighborhoods where the police cannot go in, basically. They're controlled by other actors, and they have weapons. And you're still a democratic country that holds election for 200 years in a row, and all of that. So there's not only the over-regulation, but just the absence of capacity to implement those regulations, the overburdened judicial system, corruption, among many other issues that I would say they are then there. So my main point is, for sure, maybe we can deregulate some things and make the ease of doing business index go a little bit better in some of those countries, but you can reduce the taxes and make investment decisions easier and less complicated. Instead of 60 days to open a new business, you might need 3. But what's the investor security if the rule of law cannot solve a dispute in the judicial system? What is the investment security if you have many other of these issues going on? So I don't think deregulating or simplifying would be the way to solve some of these issues, because they're deeper, and I think you need to go to more structural changes to facilitate that.
I have one last question here from our audience. Can you give us specific ideas to increase quality of life and increase GDP without increasing the need for resources?
That was not for me.
Sure, I can answer that 1 minute, and then it's solved. We don't need degrowth anymore. No, of course not. I was maybe today a little bit controversial, because I think you're very much already acquainted with the traditional perspectives. But of course, there's a lot we can do. Like I yeah, I wish you know what the building standards are for global south countries. They're terrible. They're terrible, and they're not being improved, and the people are being stuck with gas ovens and a lot of things that are not useful in the future and have terrible isolation. So you could build better and decrease the need for these people using AC, which, by the way, takes 30% of their income afterwards. So making a change in the way you design the city and the way you have your building codes, like a lot of these things, they won't sacrifice growth. They will increase the quality of life, and in the longer term, or depending even in the short term, they could even be cheaper. And they're about, I would say, these low-hanging fruits: energy efficiency, enormous possibilities; urban planning, enormous possibilities; public goods, basically, including public transport, including many public housing, many other things. They have huge potential. They don't need to sacrifice growth. They can help us enormously to decrease the resource intensity, and they can even make people's life better and cheaper in the long run. So obviously, it's not going to solve it all, but I think there's still quite a lot of potential of improvement before we talk about canceling the number of flights people can take and all these radical things that are usually spoken about when we talk about sufficiency or degrowth.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Paola, and thank you, Michael, for this conversation.